Sea Legs by Frank Quattrocchi. Part 2 and Conclusion. Craig's head was in a whirl despite the strong dose of para-oxylnebutol he had taken in the station clinic. He felt closed in and befogged. He could remember almost nothing of the night in civil control. Even the clinic was fading from his memory. He was aware that he stank, that he was dirty, that his clothing clung to his body. He was miserable. He must call import. He was due to begin work this morning, his period of personal adjustment complete. Instead, Craig turned and began to walk. He could not carry on a coherent conversation in his present state. He could never find his way unassisted back to his apartment. He was not even sure he remembered the address. But the thought of returning to his quarters, to import, sickened him. What was his address? East 71, North... No, that would be the old lady Brockman. The association irritated him. He had completely forgotten the unwanted assignment, had forgotten to inquire where the address could be found. Craig became aware of the heavy flow of vehicular traffic that roared a scant 8 feet away. Large surface carriers whistled in the nearest lane of the complex 4-lane pattern. Then there were the private surface craft. They were of many sizes and shapes. He guessed that they were turbine-powered, but he could not identify the odor of their exhausts. There was an odd, unreal quality about the busy thoroughfare. Even myriad sounds from it were sounds he had never heard before and could not break down into their component parts. Craig became aware of other humans, many of them, on the sidewalk. Again, they were of a class that he could not identify. They had none of the brisk, purposeful stride of those he had seen near import. They lacked also the graceful, colorful dress. Their faces, so far as he could separate from the blurring film over his eyes, were different. They seemed somehow looser faces, though Craig did not know exactly what he meant by the term. They were not tight, pinched, set, as were the faces he had seen before on Terra. There were bulbous noses, large ears, squint eyes, disheveled hair, the men's and women's faces strangely similar. Some were young, some old, but few were hard or fixed. They seemed more plastic, more full of expression than those he had come to know elsewhere in the city. He felt an inexplicable craving to know someone on this strange street. "You looking for something, mister?" asked a voice near him. Craig turned to find a middle-aged man eyeing him from the doorway of an empty building. "I got it," the man added. Got what?" Craig asked. "Anything a guy just out of the can would want." "What would a guy just out of the can want that you have?" Craig examined the weathered, sharp face. It was an unpleasant one, but it belonged to this street. It would do to tell him what he wanted to know of the place. "Follow me." The man quickly inserted a magna key into the door of the vacant store building. "There's a station just up the street," Craig warned. "Sure. So what?" The empty room was dusty and dark, and received little light through the grimy display windows that faced on the street. What kind of store it had been, Craig could not guess. The man led him through a kind of storage room which was piled high with moldy paper cartons and back to a rear door. With quick, dexterous movements, the man swung an ancient bar assembly and pushed open the rear door. It led to a litter-strewn yard enclosed by rough, eroded shacks and a wooden garage. They entered the garage through a creaking hinged door. It was a dank, almost completely dark room. Craig stumbled over something on the floor and fell against a packing box of some kind. "Just stand still," said the man. He was shuffling invisibly about in the darkness. Craig could hear him opening a kind of cabinet or drawer while saying in a steady monotone, "You got the right man, mister. My stuff is pure. You can test it, but you'd rather drink it, right?" For the 10th time, Craig asked himself why he had accepted the furtive invitation. The thought of this man's kind of intoxicant, however pure, nauseated him. Nevertheless, he felt himself compelled by a kind of insatiable curiosity to follow out the part he had accepted. Perhaps through this man, through this somehow fascinating street, he could... "You got 10, I know that. Maybe you got more, huh?" The man interrupted his confused train of thought. "What makes you think I got 10? Craig asked. He did not know himself how many units his wallet contained. Certainly not after the previous night. "Don't get sore. I'm honest, but I know you got 10. Otherwise you wouldn't have got out of the station." The lack of clearly defined objects by which to orient himself in the darkness of the garage made his head begin to swim once more. He wanted to leave. "Don't get scared, buddy. They don't ever come in here." Craig fumbled for support in the darkness. He was afraid he would be sick. Fulfillment for the half-formed plan that was beginning to take shape in his mind would not come with the bootlegger. It would come into being somehow in the tawdry street he had just left, only he did not know how. "They really don't go after polyester. They don't want to stop the stuff. It makes their job easier. You don't have to worry, buddy. Come on, how much you want? You might have trouble finding more for a while." Craig said nothing. He fumbled for a grip on a packing box. "You're from out, aren't you, buddy? You ain't used to us here yet. Most of my customers are from out. What jam did you get into?" "I got 10 units, I think," Craig evaded. "It ain't none of my business what you done. Nobody around here is going to ask you any questions. Long as you got units, you get poly, just like the big shots that come over here all the time from uptown." "Yeah," said Craig. "Give me what I get for 10 units, and let's beat it out of here." "Myself, I never been out. Not even Luna. Never wanted to. I stay here and have my little business. You can call it a business. You'll see, buddy, there are millions of guys like me. The controllers don't stop us. We're respectable. A damn sight more respectable than those—" "All right," snapped Craig. "Let's get out of here." "You got it bad, huh? This poly will fix that up. It's pure. You just come back to Old Knave and get poly." How you get out of here?" Craig asked, nauseated. "Got lost pretty easy in the dark, huh?" The man was beginning to mock him. Craig lashed out suddenly at the unseen face in the darkness. He caught the thin throat in his left hand. His right left the packing box and cocked to deliver a blow, but he began to fall and had to let go. "Okay, buddy, okay," the other man said soothingly as Craig was forced to catch himself. "I like ex-spacemen. I know lots of you. I sell you poly. You don't want to get tough with me." He shoved a block of 10 small cubes into Craig's hand, and while Craig fished for his wallet, he produced a tiny, narrow-beamed flash. The transaction was quickly over. The cube was small enough to be forced without much difficulty into Craig's jacket pocket. The man led him back across the littered yard, through the empty store building, and out the front door. When Craig emerged onto the street once more, a uniformed figure was standing nearby. "He'll need 2, whispered the man from behind him. Craig reached into his pocket and mechanically fumbled 2 of the small cubes of wax-like substance from the loose package. He placed them on the outstretched hand of the civil control officer. The officer did not look in his direction at any time, but accepted the offer and walked slowly on toward the station. Craig continued aimlessly down the long street. His head cleared as he walked, and once more began to form a kind of vague plan. There was anonymity to a street such as this. There was also a kind of freedom. Everywhere in the universe there were such streets, neutralized streets, where a kind of compromise was reached between law and lawlessness. They were permitted because it was always necessary to provide such a place for those who were not permitted elsewhere, those who would not fit, could not be rehabilitated, could neither be jailed nor permitted complete freedom. Controllers of one kind or another patrolled such streets, keeping them in a kind of check, or, more accurately, in a kind of containment. But no amount of control would ever completely stamp out the likes of Knave, the bootlegger. Perhaps here, on this street, Craig could be lost. Here he might find security for a time and anonymity. Security and a time to find a way. To what? He did not know. "Mister! Mister!" cried a thin, high voice from somewhere to his left. "Here, quick!" It was a young boy of perhaps 9 or 10. Craig caught sight of him as he motioned urgently. He wore a shabby, torn version of what appeared to be a space service uniform. "I'm not buying anything, son," Craig said, pausing briefly. "Come here, quick," insisted the boy, his eyes large in a dirty face. "You already bought too much." The boy was motioning him to follow. He had stepped between 2 buildings. Craig approached him with suspicion. "What did you say?" "Slip in here, quick. You bought from Nave the peddler. You bought Polly, didn't you?" "How did you—" Craig began. "Tell you later. Slip through here quick, or they'll send you to Hardy." The genuine fear of the youngster conveyed itself to Craig. With effort, he forced his body through the space between the old buildings. At first he did not intend to follow the boy, but only to stop him for an explanation. The boy, however, continued down the tight corridor formed by the buildings. "There's a window soon," he said from ahead of Craig. "Hurry, you lost time with that peddler." Lost time? Cursing himself for becoming involved again in something he did not understand, Craig nevertheless followed as best he could. It was a tight squeeze, and he found himself becoming breathless. "Dive down!" shouted the boy, looking back with terror in his eyes. Instinctively Craig did so. The rough walls tore at his suit. "Stop!" shouted a voice from behind Craig. "Stop, or we fire!" Craig suddenly felt the sill of a window which opened into the building to his left. He quickly pulled himself into it. There was a sickening whine, and a part of the window disintegrated in a cloud of splinters and plaster. "Through here," said the boy from the semi-darkness. "They'll blast their way inside in a minute." Craig found himself in another empty building. He followed the boy through a doorway and felt his way as he half ran along the dark hall. "Who are they?" he panted. "Controllers." "Civil control?" "Sure. You must be pretty important. I didn't get it all, but they say the controllers checked up on you after— I'll explain later." The hall ended in a dim room piled high with plasma light packing boxes in great disarray. The boy chose a box and lifted a lid. "Follow me. It's a passage." "Where to?" "No time now. Down here." The passage, which seemed to be constructed of plasma light boxes, seemed somehow lit by daylight, although Craig could not actually see the source of the light. The tunnel ended in broad afternoon daylight. As he climbed out, he saw a large clearing surrounded by ruins. "We're just inside the old city," the boy said. "We're safe now, unless those controllers are willing to take more chances than I think." "Wait a minute, son. You said old city. You mean that this is a part of pre-war Los Angeles?" "Well, sure. But that's supposed to be radioactive?" "Most of it, anyway. Good thing, too. Otherwise, we'd have no place to go." "Look, kid, you better explain," said Craig. "You were right about somebody being after me, but I don't get the we business, or how you knew all about this." "All right, mister, but let's get away from here. Those guys won't come through to here, even if they find a way. I don't think. But they're getting smarter, and you're pretty hot right now." The boy led the way to what appeared to be a completely demolished building. "Used to be the old library," he said. They circled the heap of plaster, brick, and twisted steel. On the other side, Craig saw what appeared to be a window. The boy let himself down through it. Craig was amazed to find a large, relatively clear area inside, probably part of an old room that had been spared by some freak of the blast. "You live here?" Craig asked the youngster incredulously. "Part of the time." The boy brought up an old crate and offered it to Craig as a chair. "Listen, mister, I don't know who you are. You're an ex-spaceman, and that's enough for me." There was a slightly amusing attempt at adult hardness about him. "You shouldn't have wasted time with Nave. You should have got out of there." "Why?" I don't know. What you done, anyway? I don't remember. Passed out at a bar. The boy showed disgust. He glanced at the pocket which contained the polyester. Craig smiled. I don't use this stuff. At least, not enough to deserve what you're thinking. He tossed the remaining cubes on the littered floor of the room. The boy maintained his look of scorn for a time, but then softened. I was afraid you got kicked out of the service for that. How did you know I was ever in it? Easy. You don't know how to walk on a planet yet. Anybody can tell. I didn't get kicked out, Craig said. I came here to take a civil service job. It'd almost be better if you had been. I didn't know about Tara. None of us had any idea. I know, said the boy sadly. My father quit too. He quit to marry my mother. That was before it was so bad. Where, Craig began, then bit off the question. Oh, gee, mister, Tara's in an awful bad shape. They took my parents. They hunt us down. Craig approached the boy and put a hand on his shoulder. What's your name, son? Phil. Phil what? I don't know exactly. My father had to use so many names toward the end. He once had only one name, but I guess even he forgot what it was. They prepared to spend the night in the old library room, but first Phil left it and made his way into the wilderness of rubble. He returned dragging a packing box of plastic insulating material, out of which they fashioned a crude bed. Despite the thousands of questions that paraded across Craig's mind, he waited each time for the boy to speak. I can't take you any further until you know more about me? In a way, they'll let me know. Craig would have risked much to identify the they Phil referred to, but he did not ask the question. As he watched the boy preparing the dimly lit room for the night, he felt sure Phil could be trusted. He was almost frighteningly mature for his age. The room was well hidden, for the once great library lay in a powdered ruin about it on all sides but part of one. Only by accident or knowledge would a stranger recognize it in what was literally a world of rubble. During the moments of silence between the boy's volunteered statements, Craig tried to visualize the awful catastrophe that had befallen the old city. Piles of powdered masonry restricted his view greatly under the gathering night. He could see a scant city block through the windows, but he knew the wreckage around them must extend for miles. You don't have to worry, Mr. Craig. Mr. Craig, they don't come here at night. Radioactivity? Yes. Not right here, but all around, everywhere. What? It's all around us. You go through it to get here, but you can't stay anywhere but a few places like this. How do you know all of these things, Phil? Oh, we know all right. We had to find out. You must have ion counters, he said in what he hoped was a casual tone. We have lots of things. Craig was thoughtful for a minute. The boy was obviously on his guard now. Those empty buildings, Craig asked tentatively. They built them too close, said the boy. It seemed to be a safe subject. They built them up as close as they thought was safe. Space is very valuable here, but they built them too close. Yet the we you speak of live even closer? The boy bit his lip and eyed him suspiciously in silence. Look, kid, Craig said very deliberately, I'm not a controller, and I'm not interested in a bunch of petty thieves. The effect was just what he had intended. We're not thieves, and we're not traitors either. The boy was almost in tears. Craig waited a moment, then continued in a soft voice. Phil, I'm just beginning to realize what a rotten place Tara is. From just what I've seen, it isn't very much. I can imagine such a system producing a great many we groups like yours. I don't know who you are or what you are, but you can't be any worse than what I've already seen of Terran officials. Tell me, kid, what's it all about, and is there any way out of here? I mean, way out. You may tell him, Philip, said a quiet voice from the window entrance. "Like us, Philip, Mr. Craig is an enemy of tyranny, though he doesn't realize it yet." Craig instinctively jumped back to get out of range of the window, meanwhile feeling around for something that could be used as a weapon. But the boy ran to the silhouetted figure in the window. "Mr. Sam!" he cried eagerly. Craig relaxed his hold on a strip of heavy metal. When the man had entered, the boy pulled a ragged black cloth across the window once more. He then ignited a small oil-burning lamp in a carved-out nook in the wall. "It's all right, Philip. Nobody is following me," the newcomer said. Craig studied his face. It was an old face covered by a stained gray beard. With a shock, Craig recognized the man as a tramp he had seen earlier on the street, napping, sprawled in a doorway. Now, for the first time, he saw the eyes, sharp and clear. They caught up the yellow night of the oil lamp and glowed warmly as they turned to Craig. "I am Mr. Sam, Mr. Craig. You might know me by the full name, Samuel Cocteau, but I doubt it. Even the names of the infamous do not penetrate space." "I guess not," Craig agreed. "But you said something about my being an enemy of tyranny. Whether you like it at once or not, you are temporarily one of us, one of the we Philip has been speaking of. But all of that in due time. Right now it is necessary for us to leave here." "They're going to try to find us tonight?" asked Phil, startled. "Yes, a tribute to Mr. Craig," said the old man. "A Geiger team is being readied at the station." Craig started to protest as the boy began hurriedly to pick up his few possessions in the room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Craig," the man said. "I must ask you to decide now whether to trust us and our judgment. There is grave danger for you if you are caught by the civil control. The report I have received is that you are largely unaware of the crimes against the state you have committed. The civil control hoped to capture you before you find them out. But that, of course, is my word only. There is no time to give you proof, even if I had it." Craig's mind whirled under the sudden onslaught of new facts. He had followed a peddler without knowing why he did it. He had bought polyester he had no use for. He had followed a boy who beckoned to him. Now, how much longer was he to move haphazardly through Terra like a cork on a wind-blown sea? Who were these strange fugitives who said he was one of them, and who lived in the heart of a radioactive city? "Well, Mr. Craig?" asked Cocteau quietly. Craig glanced at the boy. The child's eyes were wide and pleading in the dim light of the oil lamp. "Let's go," Craig said. Darkness was swiftly falling on the wilderness of heaping ruin. The three made their way toward what Craig at first thought was an unbroken wall of rubble. The near horizontal rays of the sun tipped the white mass of broken stone with brilliance, and gave the entire scene an unearthly quality. Below the towering rubble mountains, long black shadows were reaching toward what Craig knew to be the living city. Cocteau took the lead and set a fast pace for a man of his age. He took a highly devious path through the mountain, or what began to seem to Craig needlessly difficult, that outlined them against the bright western sky. At one point Craig left the invisible path of the older man to avoid an exhaustingly steep rise. "Follow me exactly," warned Cocteau in a sharp voice. "There is only one relatively safe path through here. They'll see us against the sky. It cannot be helped." There was no indication that they were followed. They pushed onward, scurrying over heaps of weathered plaster and brick. The old man seemed to avoid with great care places where metal girders were visible. The exertion, together with walking directly into the setting sun, made Craig begin to feel the old nausea return. He resisted it for a time, but it would not be repressed, particularly as he strove to maintain his balance on difficult climbs. Once he stumbled on a splintered building stone and fell. It was a long minute before he could regain his feet and mutter a feeble, "Sorry." "We must push on, Mr. Craig," was Cocteau's only comment. "It's safe here for a minute, isn't it?" Craig panted, dizzy and breathless. "There is no safe place here, Mr. Craig." They continued their winding way through the growing darkness. For Craig, it became a nightmare of stumbling over the endless piles of sharp stones. His mind spun sickeningly, and he retched as he half ran along the path Cocteau set for him. "Please, mister," breathed the voice of Phil behind him. "It isn't so far now." Doggedness carried Craig onward, long after awareness left him. He became conscious suddenly, as though by an injection of stimulant. He found himself surrounded by a number of figures, including Cocteau and a white-garbed man, evidently a doctor. "You are quite safe now, Mr. Craig," said Cocteau warmly. "Welcome to the city of We." "Where are we?" "Deep in the old city, in a place where the radioactivity is negligible," the man answered as the doctor took his pulse. "This is Dr. Grant, and these others are members of the Liberty Party." "Liberty? You've heard of it?" "Yeah, you're pretty unpopular, aren't you?" "Unpopular? Let us say that all of Terran officialdom is dedicated to exterminating us. The committee on something or other asked me about my attitudes toward the Liberty Party," said Craig, rising to a sitting position on the cot. "And at the time you had a lack of attitude, which most likely was unacceptable to them," supplied Cocteau, smiling. "Well, you may be interested to know that you are considered one of us by most of Terra just now." "What?" "That is correct," said another of the group. "It seems you were in a bar in a somewhat less than fully conscious state." "But I didn't know anything about the Liberty Party." "No, nor is it alleged that you actually mentioned the party in so many words," continued the white-haired man, smiling. "But it seems that you did make certain statements in the presence of certain persons that did indicate a definite predilection." "That's crazy," said Craig angrily. "Of course," Cocteau agreed. "Furthermore," the other man said, "you are charged with willful abandonment of duty and acts indicative of your desire to shun the best utilization of your talents in behalf of the state of Terra." "In other words," explained Cocteau, "you applied for a job on a private space freighter, without permission to do so." Craig was silent. He lay back down on the cot and tried to absorb the data he had just received. "So, I'm accused of belonging to something I don't know anything about." "Well, then, I'll tell you briefly about us. You have a right to know the magnitude of the crime with which you are charged." Cocteau took a seat by Craig's cot. The others also found chairs. "But first, a brief bit of history. A history that you have never heard before. Not your fault. It is not allowed to penetrate Terra's atmosphere." "I don't know much about Terra," Craig interjected. "I'm just finding out how much I don't know." "God, I wish the rest of the universe could find out with you," said one of the group. "Yes, the history of Terra is almost lost now. That is, the part of it that followed the great wars of 75 years ago. You know of those wars. You have just walked through one of the physical results of them. No nation or alliance of nations can be said to have won them, but the wars had a most profound effect on Terra. More than anything else, they made men ready to reach the stars, if only to escape the deadly conflicts of Terra. Ideological issues were involved, naturally, but the underlying cause of the great wars was the struggle for power. The world was disunited. Peoples were divided from peoples by an almost inconceivable number of unimportant distinctions. These were ethnical, national, racial, cultural. Name any brand of prejudice, and you'll find it existed then. Incredibly enough, the destructiveness of the great wars accomplished a kind of unity. Gone were the once proud, aggressive nations, gone into oblivion. Gone, too, were the systems of economics and sociology of which men were once so sure. There was a kind of plague on both your houses attitude among the peoples of the world. There was a large measure of anarchy following the great wars, not of violent, active anarchy of hate and terror, but of apathy and weariness. Apathy at the outcome of false conflicts, and weariness of the self-defeating strife of man against man. At first, men produced by the full extent of their labors barely enough on which to survive. Only gradually did they regain their ability to produce surpluses once more. Of course, surpluses means exchange, trade, and trade requires order and system. The first 10 years following the Great Wars was a period of gradualism in all things. Peoples united in small groups. There were no political or racial divisions. The units were built upon functional lines. They were natural and free. Above all, they were cooperative. It was not communism. Men knew all that too well, the mental and physical slavery of that brutally rigid system. It was not rugged individualism either. Rugged individuals during this period either starved or were driven out by the starving. This natural cooperative unity spread and became more complex. There came into being natural associations of units, not exclusive but inclusive associations that linked all who would join and who could produce surpluses. Productivity increased thereby. Men were intelligent enough to avoid many of the old abuses. Ways were found to harness the productivity of each man and woman. Genuine efforts were made to avoid misfits, to make those who produced fit. It was realized, Mr. Craig, that the unhappy man will infect others with his misery, and the trouble he will cause is much more difficult to undo than to prevent in the first place. There were, of course, mistakes, false starts, but the newfound system of the worldwide unity proved flexible. It was multiple-based. To a very large degree, all men fitted into it logically and naturally. It was the first truly grassroots economic and social system in the history of man, and it was a great tribute to his ability to work out his destiny, particularly since it came after a tragedy that was so enormous and devastating. The list of its successes is incredible. For in a decade, the age-old problem of poverty seemed to have disappeared. There were no significant outbreaks of disorder and lawlessness. Indeed, there were comparatively little need for a written law. The principle of mutuality and cooperation was too strongly conditioned into the people. Scientifically, the first half of the new century, a scant 25 years after the last bomb was dropped, was the greatest in man's history. Man reached the stars. He began to know the molecule, the atom, the electron. He pushed the frontier of his knowledge deep into both microcosm and macrocosm. But a fatal flaw had long before developed in the structure, wonderful as it was. It was an age-old flaw. It was one that was disguised by the very nature of the new system. When it was recognized, that flaw had so weakened the system that its spread was all but inevitable. It is a flaw that will always plague man to a certain extent, but one that must keep us eternally vigilant. It is this: the greatest human good comes not in how well you learn to control man and keep him from harming himself. What determines it is how completely you learn to free him. Conversely, the law provides that no control system, however devised, will succeed in bringing happiness and security to man to any greater extent than it permits the fullest expression of his nature. Man is inherently good. He will always choose a moral path when free to do so. He strives for justice and truth both as an individual and in mass. Mr. Craig, democracy is man's greatest a priori. Yet based upon a law of restraint, it cannot escape the hopeless contradiction that leads to its own destruction. Man can democratically do the irrational and the insane. He can democratically limit and coerce the absolute highest nature of himself. Bad laws are forever passed to achieve good ends, but each new law produces new criminals, while the cause of the new crimes remain unsolved. Ergo, the world you have just seen. Ergo, the Liberty Party, Mr. Craig. Our world is ruled by a vast and horrible bureaucracy whose terrible weapon is conformity. You would find few laws even today written in books. Our assemblies pass few statutes. They determine dogma instead. They resolve and move. They fix a new position, define a stand. Our equivalent of judge and attorney is no student of law. He is a kind of moralist. He is sensitive to the trend and appreciative of the proper. Terra fits uncomfortably in the intergalactic system. Like many of the undemocratic systems of the dark past, the Terran state must expand. It is based upon a self-limiting philosophy unless it can spread fast enough. You are charged with being un-Terran, Mr. Craig. A system that forever seeks un-Terrans must inevitably exile or kill itself. It had been a long speech. Craig had listened in awe, for it was a completely new story to him. "And you propose to destroy this bureaucracy," he said. "Insofar as it is a philosophical entity, yes. And you say I am one of you now? You are considered one of us. Your employer and his secretary are also suspected. But I'm entitled to a trial, or at least a hearing." "Not now, Mr. Craig. It would do you very little good anyway. The position of the Assembly on subversion is that it rightly behooves every loyal Terran so to conduct his behavior that a suspicion of membership in the Liberty Party is unthinkable." Craig found himself regretting every minute of his stay on Terra. Old Brockman had been right. It was no place for a spaceman. Now it was probably too late. No Terran space freighter would accept him, and Intergalactic could not. There was not even a way for him to recover his service records. "Will you join us, Mr. Craig?" asked one of the men. "We can use your skills, particularly your knowledge of space." "Look, how do I know you aren't a bunch of traitors? Maybe all this you've told me is true. I've seen plenty of that bureaucracy, and there seems to be so damned little freedom of action left on Terra. But how do I know you can do any better when you get in power?" "Liberty will never be in power, Mr. Craig," Cocteau said quietly. "Liberty will attempt to reach the minds of the people with our message of hope, of freedom in true democracy." Another of the group joined Cocteau. "We are now hunted as criminals. We have only this small stronghold in the old city." "We shall attempt only to gain entry to the minds of the people," said Cocteau. "Gain entry, to tell them how they live, for most of them have no contact with any other kind of life." "It would mean killing a few people," Craig pointed out. "One of the basic principles of liberty is the inherent goodness of every man," Cocteau repeated. "We have never taken a life, even in self-defense. We shall never take one, nor will it ever be necessary for a member of the Liberty Party to hold public office, to own a weapon, to coerce a man in any physical way." "But you will coerce them with ideas. Is that what you have in mind?" Craig protested. "If a point of view, a promise, a goal is coercion, then the answer to your question is yes. But ideas are not dangerous when a man is free to argue and act against them." "Look here, Cocteau," Craig said earnestly. "All you say may be true. I believe it is, but what can I do? I'm a spaceman, or at best an apprentice import clerk. I don't know anything about this sort of work." "Come here a moment," invited a member of the group. Through the window indicated by the man, Craig saw an incredible sight. The entire scene seemed to be on the inside of a vast underground cavern. There were other buildings and some kind of systematic work being done by many men and women. But the thing that caught Craig's eye seemed to be cradled in a kind of hangar. "A spaceship!" exclaimed Craig. "A very modest one. yet not so modest when you consider that it was necessary to carry in every single piece and part by hand. Good Lord! You, Mr. Craig, might captain that ship. Very few Terrans have ever flown in one. It will be necessary to establish contact with possible assistance outside of Terra. You can make that possible. Craig was thoughtful. I suppose now that I've seen all this, you can't let me leave here unless I join you. No, denied Cocteau. You may leave here any time you like. I'd be sure to get caught, of course. Within limits, it might be possible to help you avoid capture. Cocteau reached into his beggar's coat and withdrew a wallet. Identity card, food ration, clothing work card, even a government party card. It's all here, Mr. Craig. You could have a slightly altered physical appearance. Liberty accepts no unwilling members. You are given as nearly a free choice in this matter as it is possible to give you. Suppose I talked, asked Craig, nodding bluntly toward the port. Cocteau smiled. It was necessary to prepare for that. You were given a drug. It has not affected your thinking capacity in any way, but once it wears off, you will be unable to remember what took place while under its influence. When agents of the Liberty Party are sent out of here, they go having had all experience with Liberty take place while under the drug. None of us could remember for more than a few hours the exact location of this headquarters. When it is necessary to leave for very long, we carry a small amount of the drug with us. Many of our agents have been caught, and a few have resigned, but none has divulged enough information to harm us seriously. Craig was postponing his decision to the last. They must know you're somewhere in here. If the radioactivity keeps them out, why shouldn't they put a cordon around the entire old city? Periodically they try. But there are many, many other ways of leaving here than by the surface. Underground water conduits, ancient power and sewer lines, a number of tunnels we have dug. Craig was solemnly handed the wallet. If you will submit to sufficient plastic surgery to make you resemble this man, you may safely leave here no later than tomorrow night. A long silence ensued. It was interrupted by a noise from outside the door of the room. It was the voice of Phil. "Has he decided to stay? Did you see him? He looks like my daddy did. Will he stay?" "You mustn't interrupt, son. They're in conference now. We'll let you know." "Tell him yes," said Craig in a loud voice. "Tell him, hell yes, I'm staying." The men gathered round him to congratulate him on the decision. Phil was allowed into the clinic to join them. "Oh, Cocteau, one more thing," Craig said. "Yes?" Craig was fumbling for his own wallet. He extracted a folded card. "Where would East 71, North 101, number 4 be?" It would have been somewhere here, in the old city. Oh, God! How did the old guy expect me to deliver this message? Old man named Brockman. He sent me a message just before he died in gravitation. I was to visit his wife. "Brockman?" asked Cocteau. "You mean Ethel Brockman?" "Yeah. How'd you know?" Ethel Brockman was one of the organizers of the Liberty Party. She served as its chairman until her death only a few years ago. Her husband must have felt your sea legs would lead you to us eventually. And, of course, they did. Good night, Nora.